Judge Boasberg came after Karoline with accusations and attitude. What he didn't expect was to be cuffed and walked out before she ever finished her sentence. It was supposed to be just another day at the E. Barrett Pretty Man Federal Courthouse in Washington, D.C. Rows of suited attorneys, a half-asleep bailiff, and that low courtroom murmur that only breaks when the judge enters. Karoline Leavitt sat upright, back straight, hands folded on the wooden desk before her. Her posture said calm. Her eyes? Not so much. She'd been through enough media storms in her time, first as a congressional spokesperson, then as a campaign manager, and finally the unexpected transition into the courtroom spotlight after a smear campaign spiraled into a legal war. This hearing was the latest twist in a public defamation case. She wasn't on trial in the traditional sense, but what happened here could destroy what was left of her career. Her legal team had advised her to remain composed, answer only what was asked, and keep her cool. But even they hadn't expected what was coming. Judge James Boasberg entered precisely at 9 a.m., as he always did. Robe crisp, face unreadable. He sat like stone, spoke like clockwork, and had a reputation for being meticulous, but fair. At least, that was the reputation. Across the room, sitting behind a small desk near the back, Jasmine Hartwell adjusted the volume on her recorder. She'd been covering courtrooms for 20 years, had watched careers built and shattered from inside these walls. But today, something gnawed at her. Boasberg had been different lately, less patient, more reactive. Rumors had started surfacing weeks ago, and Jasmine wasn't one to ignore a hunch. Karoline was called to the stand. She stood, walked steadily, took the oath. Jasmine watched her closely, not as a reporter covering the case, but as a woman who knew how media narratives could be twisted. Karoline had made mistakes, sure, but this trial reeked of something deeper. "Miss Leavitt," Boasberg said as he peered over his glasses, "you've worked in several political offices, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Have you ever knowingly released sensitive information about a candidate or a member of Congress to a journalist, off the record or otherwise?" Her eyebrows twitched. "No, sir. I've followed standard communications protocol throughout my career." A normal question, but Boasberg didn't stop. He leaned forward slightly. "And yet, 3 months before this lawsuit was filed, you attended a closed-door fundraiser in Phoenix. According to travel records, your hotel was paid for by someone connected to Nashford and Price Strategies. Why is that?" Karoline blinked but didn't flinch. "That trip was related to a consulting role I took after resigning from my previous job. I've already submitted those documents." "I've seen the documents," Boasberg said, voice low. "What I don't see is why a newly formed PAC with 0 declared donors would foot your entire travel bill, only for you to then appear in a story that discredited a sitting congressman weeks later." The room got quieter. Jasmine sat forward slightly. That question was loaded. It wasn't just about political optics. It felt like a setup. Karoline glanced at her lawyer, who stayed motionless. She cleared her throat. "With all due respect, Your Honor, those connections were examined by federal auditors and no misconduct was found. I can't control speculation from online blogs or—" Boasberg cut her off. "I'm not talking about blogs. I'm talking about intent, motive, influence." This wasn't standard questioning. This was something else entirely. And Jasmine knew it. She flipped open her notebook. Her eyes darted between the judge and Karoline. She recognized the phrase Nashford and Price. It had come up in her own reporting, a firm with shell companies tied to dark money interests. But why was Boasberg the one digging this deep, this aggressively? And now something wasn't right. And Jasmine had a folder sitting under her desk that might explain everything, but she knew she had to wait just a little longer for the exact moment to use it. Boasberg adjusted his chair, leaned in just enough to make the air feel heavier, and locked his eyes on Karoline like a hawk circling prey. You could almost hear the tension stretching thin, like something was about to give. "Miss Leavitt," he said slowly, "do you consider yourself loyal to the truth?" The question hung in the room longer than it should have. Karoline looked directly at him, lips pressed tight before answering. "Yes, I do." "Then why," he continued, thumbing through a manila folder beside him, "were you in direct email contact with Marlon Drevitt, The same media consultant now under investigation for blackmail and document forgery? That name hit the room like a slap. Even Karoline's lawyer turned his head. She paused, gathering herself. I consulted Marlon for a media training seminar over 2 years ago. I haven't worked with him since. Any suggestion that I'm tied to his legal issues is completely out of context. Boasberg held up a printed email, waved it lightly. This was from last year, not 2. Jasmine's pen stopped moving. Her eyes narrowed. She'd seen that email before, in a tip she received anonymously. But she also knew the context. That message had been part of a massive email leak, much of it doctored or taken out of thread. She even published a short expose on it last fall. Boasberg's version was stripped of timestamps, no headers, no metadata. That wasn't just bad practice. That was manipulation. Karoline took a breath. Her voice stayed calm, but you could see her fingers digging into the wood of the witness stand. I would ask the court to verify the source and authenticity of that email, because the one I have, on record, shows it's incomplete. Boasberg didn't like that. He didn't respond. He simply moved on. And tell me, why did you scrub your LinkedIn history for the years 2018 through 2020? The gallery murmured. It was a petty question, irrelevant, a cheap shot. Karoline's attorney rose finally. Objection, Your Honor, relevance? Sustained, Boasberg replied, but the smirk on his face stayed a few seconds longer than it should have. Karoline lowered her eyes, swallowed hard. Jasmine felt her chest tighten. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how Boasberg used to handle witnesses. She remembered watching him preside over a corporate fraud case last year. He was balanced, unflinching, yes, but respectful. What changed? And then it clicked. Boasberg wasn't trying to extract truth. He was baiting her into slipping, into showing emotion, so he could build a narrative around instability, around dishonesty. He was laying groundwork for something that hadn't been said yet. Across the courtroom, one of Jasmine's sources, a junior clerk named Devin Marks, caught her eye. He gave the slightest nod, then looked toward the clerk's bench. A small envelope sat there, one Jasmine had slipped to Devin earlier that morning. Inside was a summary of communications between Judge Boasberg and a consultant linked to Nashford and Price. It included meeting dates, overlapping travel receipts, and a shared encrypted server. And Jasmine had something even stronger. Copies of their private email exchanges. All signed, all time-stamped. But she couldn't release them herself. If she did, it would be dismissed as editorial interference. She needed the court to act first. Boasberg turned back to Karoline. Do you still stand by your public statement from last September when you said certain government bodies are actively working to silence political outsiders like yourself? Karoline lifted her chin. Yes, I stand by it. Even now? Especially now. The judge sat back slowly. Well, I suppose we'll let the facts decide that. But Jasmine knew what the facts really said, and that Boasberg's time behind that bench was almost up. 6 months earlier, Jasmine Hartwell had been working late in a booth at a diner just outside of Frederick, Maryland. A man named Elias Goff had slid into the seat across from her without a word. She didn't flinch. She recognized him from a source meeting 2 years earlier. Then he was nervous, disorganized. But this time he looked different, focused, agitated. He pulled a flash drive from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. I shouldn't even be here, he whispered, but you're the only one I trust not to twist this. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. What's on it? Email dumps, internal schedules, a memo from Nashford and Price. You'll want to pay attention to the recurring initials. JB. Judge Boasberg. Jasmine didn't show it on her face, but inside something moved. Back in her apartment later that night, she sat hunched over her laptop, screen glowing into the early morning. The files were raw, too raw to publish. But if they were real, they pointed to something dark. Secret meetings between Boasberg and representatives from the very firm now linked to coordinated media takedowns, hush money funnels, and digital smearing campaigns. She couldn't go public yet. The legal risk was too great. But Jasmine had spent her whole career building credibility, not chasing clicks. She went to work. She cross-referenced Boasberg's schedule with flight logs, hotel bookings, dinner reservations. One night in Miami stood out. A room service receipt signed JB from a suite booked under a corporate alias linked to Nashford and Price. 3 nights before Karoline's name appeared in a coordinated smear campaign targeting former aides tied to a whistleblower report. This wasn't coincidence. It was a blueprint. Jasmine filed a private report with the Federal Judicial Ethics Committee, knowing full well it could be buried. She contacted a few trusted legal watchdogs too, but the silence that followed told her enough. Whatever this was, it went deeper than just one judge. That's when she stopped playing by the book. She started building a quiet trail of evidence. Handwritten notes, timelines, quotes, and screenshots. No leaks, no blogs, just her, the facts, and a hard drive labeled Boasberg Final. In between all this, she kept covering Karoline's trial. Every hearing, every testimony, every eye roll from the bench. She noticed Boasberg's questions shifting over time. More direct, more confrontational, always targeting Karoline's judgment, her tone, her past. It wasn't just procedural, it was personal. But Jasmine wasn't reckless. She waited for patterns. She waited for someone in the system to validate even one part of her research. That person came in the form of Devin Marks, a new clerk who didn't yet know how to play the political game inside the courthouse. They met quietly one morning in the courthouse basement, near the boiler room where the sound of old pipes masked their conversation. "I've seen your name on requests," Devin said. "Boasberg's flagged your articles." "Of course he has," Jasmine replied. Devin reached into his coat. "He's been receiving envelopes from a courier service, same time every Tuesday, always marked personal, always shredded within the hour." Jasmine's voice dropped. "And the return address?" Devin nodded. "San Diego, a building leased by a company registered under Nashford and Price." That was the break she needed. Jasmine handed him a new envelope. Inside, the documents, emails, the hotel receipt, a message addressed to the U.S. Marshals Service, signed by a senior ethics lawyer from a nonprofit group Jasmine had tipped off weeks ago, one that finally responded after she showed them enough. Devin hesitated. "You sure you want this out there?" She stared at him. "It's not about what I want. It's about who's going to sit in that chair next month. And whether we let people like her," she pointed upstairs, "get swallowed for sport." But Jasmine knew she had to pick the exact moment, or everything she worked for would mean nothing. Inside the courtroom, the air had turned sharp. Every word now carried weight. Judge Boasberg sat a little too still, as if aware eyes were turning toward him more than the witness. Karoline Leavitt hadn't flinched since the last round of questioning, but something in her jaw had locked. Her voice had steadied, but her hands remained gripped on the edge of the stand. Boasberg looked ready to dig again. Another question, maybe a harsher one, maybe designed to collapse her credibility completely, was on the tip of his tongue. But then it happened. The side door opened with a low click. No one turned at first. Court staff entered all the time. But this time it wasn't a staffer. It was a uniformed deputy from the U.S. Marshal Service. A quiet hush spread from the gallery to the benches. He walked directly to the clerk's bench and handed over a sealed envelope. The clerk read the name on it twice before standing. "Your Honor," he said firmly, but without panic. "This requires immediate review. It's been marked high priority." Boasberg's eyes darted to the envelope. His fingers paused mid-turn of his notes. His composure cracked. Only slightly, but Jasmine saw it. So did Karoline. So did the dozen attorneys sitting in the front rows. With deliberate motion, Boasberg leaned forward and accepted the envelope. He opened it slowly, like he was bracing for a blow he already suspected was coming. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. He didn't speak. That silence stretched longer than anything else that morning. Jasmine watched him closely. She couldn't read the documents, but she didn't need to. She knew what was inside, because she had written most of it, and the rest had been verified by an ethics attorney with a signature that couldn't be ignored. The bailiff shifted. The deputy marshal remained at the side of the courtroom, hands clasped, eyes forward. A subtle cue, but clear enough. Boasberg finally cleared his throat. "Court will recess for 15 minutes." But no one moved. Not yet. The deputy stepped forward. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I've been instructed to ask you to come with me immediately." Whispers exploded around the room like wind rustling dry paper. Even Karoline's attorney looked around in disbelief. I beg your pardon? Boasberg asked, his voice trying to summon authority. The deputy remained still. Sir, we've received a federal complaint substantiated by internal communications, supported by a sworn affidavit. You are required to accompany us for immediate questioning. Karoline's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Her lawyer leaned closer to her, whispering fast. Jasmine didn't move. She simply blinked, once as the moment she'd waited months for came alive in front of her. Boasberg stood slowly. This is a courtroom, my courtroom. If you want to make a scene, I suggest you check your jurisdiction. That's when a second agent entered, a second uniform. This one held a sealed document pouch. Sir, the deputy repeated, you are not under arrest at this moment, but you are not to leave this courtroom without compliance. Do you understand? Boasberg's expression went blank. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. Then he looked around the room for what? No one knew. A way out? A defender? A witness? He found none. Karoline stepped off the stand, still in shock, escorted by her lawyer. For the first time since the hearing began, her shoulders dropped. Not in defeat, but in sheer disbelief that this might actually be happening. The judge walked out with the agents behind him, no cuffs, no raised voices, just a quiet march. The courtroom held its breath. And then the gavel, still resting beside the now empty bench, remained untouched. But as the door shut behind Judge Boasberg, everyone in that room realized the story had just changed direction. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The courtroom sat frozen, unsure whether to clear out or wait for someone to say it was all just a misunderstanding. But then the double doors at the back opened again. This time there was no whispering, just silence. 2 federal agents returned, same sharp uniforms, same calm expressions. But now, between them, was Judge Boasberg, hands cuffed behind his back. No resistance, no words. The sound of the cuffs clinking was the only noise in the room. Karoline's breath caught in her throat. Her lawyer stood between her and the sight, as if trying to shield her from it. But she didn't look away. She needed to see it. The judge who had cornered her on the stand. The man who had turned an entire courtroom into a stage for humiliation. The man who now couldn't even make eye contact with anyone as he was escorted out of the building. Someone in the back dropped a pen. No one moved to pick it up. The lead marshal spoke to the court clerk. Per federal order, Judge Boasberg is now being placed under arrest for judicial misconduct, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power in violation of Title 18. Karoline sat down hard. Her attorney leaned over. We're asking for a suspension of proceedings pending judicial reassignment. This entire line of questioning is now inadmissible. The clerk barely hesitated. Granted. And just like that, the trial was on pause. But no one left. Jasmine still hadn't moved. Her recorder was off now. No need for more tape. Everything was imprinted already. What she'd hoped to prove for months had just walked itself out in handcuffs. The irony? She didn't feel victory. Not really. What she felt was relief. Tired, heavy relief. Devin Marks approached her from the side quietly. They acted faster than I thought. They had everything they needed, she replied. They were just waiting for the right moment. He looked at her, then at the people still seated, still processing what they'd witnessed. What happens now? Jasmine took a second before answering. They'll reassign the case. Might even throw it out. But this is going to be bigger than just one courtroom. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered. Somehow the story had leaked within minutes. Someone had tweeted that Boasberg had been let out the back in restraints. Now cameras pointed at every door. Microphones stood stacked against fences. And Karoline, with red in her eyes but her head held high, walked through them without stopping. No statements, no dramatics, just the walk. Jasmine followed behind, a few steps back. Jasmine, one of the younger reporters called. Was this you? She didn't answer, not because it wasn't, but because it wasn't about her. Inside the building, a few members of the press pool still sat in shock. The bailiff was already on the phone with a supervisor. Court staff had gone silent, clearing papers, collecting items, doing the kind of busy work that people do when they don't know how else to process what just happened. Karoline leaned against a stone pillar just outside the steps. She finally turned to Jasmine. You knew something was coming. Jasmine nodded. You were quiet the whole time, Karoline added. You just watched. I had to, Jasmine said softly. If I'd said anything too soon, it wouldn't have meant anything. He'd have shut it down. They always do. Karoline looked down at her heels, then shook her head. Do you think this is over? Jasmine shrugged. For him? Maybe. For the system? Not even close. But for the first time in weeks, Karoline wasn't the one being hunted, and Jasmine wasn't the one being ignored. That evening, the courthouse stood behind yellow tape and a pair of watchful deputies. Cameras still lingered nearby, some waiting for an official statement, others just hungry for the image of a fallen judge. But inside a quiet Georgetown cafe, Jasmine sat with her laptop open and her fingers flying. The headline on her screen was simple: Federal judge arrested mid-trial, a timeline of power, silence, and exposure. The article read like a punch to the ribs. No fluff, no passive lines, just facts, timelines, receipts, every bit of it meticulously laid out. She didn't sensationalize what had happened. She didn't need to. The facts spoke louder than any exaggeration ever could. By the time she hit publish, it was just after 9 p.m. 3 minutes later, the site slowed down. 8 minutes later, it crashed from traffic. At 9:14 p.m., Jasmine's phone buzzed nonstop. Calls, emails, interview requests. The Washington Post wanted a quote. CNN had already aired a segment using her last piece as reference. Journalists who hadn't returned her emails in months were now begging for background. And in a small apartment across the city, Karoline sat alone, scrolling slowly through the article. She didn't cry. She didn't even smile. She just read it like someone waiting for the verdict. Not the courtroom one, but the kind that lives in headlines, in people's perception, in how the world reshapes your name once again. The photo at the top of the piece showed Boasberg being walked out in cuffs, but the real power was in the second photo. A scan of the email exchange Jasmine had held on to for weeks. Clear, undeniable, time-stamped, authenticated. Karoline tapped the screen once, then locked her phone. The next morning, she appeared in front of a courthouse again, but not to testify. She held a short press conference on the steps, standing behind a single microphone with a small group of supporters nearby. I have no comment on Judge Boasberg's arrest, she said clearly. But I do want to say this: being outspoken doesn't mean you deserve to be torn down. Being disliked doesn't mean you deserve to be silenced. The truth doesn't play favorites. Then she stepped away without answering a single follow-up. Inside her office, Jasmine watched it all on a muted feed. She sipped her coffee slowly, her recorder from the trial still sitting on the desk, like a reminder of what silence and patience could do. Devin Marks called her later that day. You're everywhere right now, she chuckled. Give it a week, they'll find another scandal. Maybe, he said, but you set a precedent. Not me, she said, looking out her window. The facts did. I just brought them to the front door. There was something sobering about it all. Boasberg wasn't just one man. He was a symptom. And Jasmine knew this wasn't the end. Someone else would rise to take his place. Someone else would test the limits of justice. But for now, she'd done her part. That night, Karoline sent her a message. It was only 2 lines long. I didn't think anyone was watching. You were. That mattered. Jasmine stared at it for a moment, then put her phone down. She didn't need a spotlight. She didn't want praise. But she knew that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to look away. Because when one person has the courage to tell the truth, it forces everyone else to stop pretending they can't see it. 2 weeks later, the news cycle had shifted, as it always does. The headlines were chasing new faces, fresh outrages, but traces of Judge Boasberg's arrest still lingered in certain corners. Legal forums, watchdog groups, and small-town papers were still talking. Quietly, carefully, but with growing purpose. Karoline didn't return to the courtroom. Her case was suspended indefinitely, pending judicial reassignment. But it wasn't just about legal delays anymore. The entire narrative had changed. She was no longer the target. She had become the survivor of a system that tried to grind her down behind closed doors. She kept her public appearances brief, short statements, no interviews. The online mobs had thinned out. The hashtags had faded. And for the first time in months, she could walk into a grocery store without someone whispering behind her back. That was the win. Not victory in court, not some sweeping moment of vindication, just being able to breathe again. Meanwhile, Jasmine took a break from writing. She didn't announce it. She didn't make it a thing. She just powered down her laptop for a few days and spent time doing things she'd long neglected. Walking along the Potomac, listening to traffic instead of audio recordings, letting the silence speak for itself. But deep down, she knew she wouldn't stay away for long, because this story, as impactful as it was, wasn't the last of its kind. One afternoon, she met Devin at a bookstore cafe near DuPont Circle. They talked about nothing at first. Old college stories, DC weather, bad coffee. Then Devin leaned in. "You think any of this really changes things?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She looked at the table. Her finger traced the rim of her mug. "It doesn't fix the system," she said finally, "but it sends a message, even if it's quiet, even if it only reaches a few people." He nodded. "And the rest?" She sighed. "The rest keep doing what they've always done, hiding in plain sight." But then she looked up, until someone else decides not to look away. And that, in her mind, was the point. Because the real fight isn't always public. It's in private moments, when a young clerk decides to speak up, when a reporter holds back instead of publishing too soon, when a woman like Karoline sits on the stand and refuses to fold. These choices don't go viral. They don't trend. But they matter. They build something harder than headlines, accountability. And maybe the lesson isn't that corruption exists. Everyone knows that. The lesson is that exposure only happens when people decide enough is enough. When one person stands up, it creates a crack. When another joins, the crack widens. And sometimes, if timing and truth collide just right, the whole thing collapses under its own weight. That's what happened here. And the lesson was simple. Power unchecked becomes dangerous. But silence, that's what keeps it alive. Karoline would go on to rebuild her career. Jasmine would eventually write a book. Devin stayed in the system, working from the inside to change what he could. None of them became famous, but they didn't need to be. They became something rarer, responsible. So if there's one thing to take from this story, it's this. Watch carefully, listen closely, speak even when your voice shakes. And above all, don't wait for someone else to act. You might be the only one who can. If this story made you feel something, share it. Subscribe for more real human stories that matter. Because truth doesn't spread on its own. People carry it. You carry it.